Hey, welcome back everyone. This is Ian bringing you the 5th video in this AI series with the new Boston. In today's video, we're going to continue using OpenAI's chat completion API, and this time we're going to leverage something called function calling. So this is going to allow us to send a description of a function or functions that we have written in our code over to the API, and the API can decide based on the other input that we provided and the description of these functions, whether or not it wants to call one of these functions in order to use the information that the function will return to generate the final response to our initial question. So that's a lot. I actually have a program flow diagram here that can kind of make a little more sense of this visually, but we're going to walk through this step by step. So don't worry if at first it's not clicking. By the time we're done with this, you're going to have everything laid out in front of you. It'll make perfect sense. So this is our program over here. And the first step is to collect the user input. In this case, we're just going to hard code ours, but you can get it dynamically like we showed in our second video in the series. And then we're going to include a functions list with some descriptions in JSON format, giving information about the functions that we have defined. So the functions will be defined separately, but the functions list is going to have information about those functions. We're going to pair that together with our user input, and then we're going to send that request over to chat completion. Now, chat completion is going to decide whether or not it wants to call one of our functions in order to generate its final response. And we'll actually be the ones calling the function. All chat does is it sends us back some parameters, and we describe the parameters in those function descriptions that we sent with our initial request. So that's how it knows what type of parameters to include. So it's going to send that back to us. We're going to check and see if it in fact did want to call a function, if so, which function, and then we're going to extract those parameters. We'll take the parameters that it gives us and we'll actually pass them into the actual function that we wrote. We'll invoke the function and get the response. We will include our function's response with the initial response from the chat completion API in our messages list back to the chat completion API so that it now has the full context, the original question, its initial response, our response from our function call using the parameters from that previous response from the API, all of that bundled together. It's going to look at that and it's going to generate the final content of that last assistant message. So that's what we get down here at the bottom. So again, it's a lot of back and forth. It's a little more complicated than some of the previous examples, but once you mess around with this and get your hands dirty, you'll realize it's actually pretty straightforward and you can easily get going with this in your code today just by messing around with some of the examples that we have provided here. So let's go ahead and look at an example and then we'll walk through the code line by line. So I'm going to run this file before we actually walk through the code, and I'm just going to show you what it does. So essentially we are defining a function that will return the weather in a given location. And we're going to pass a description of that function along to the API with our initial question, which is what is the weather in Boston, Massachusetts? So we're asking for real-time information. And this is what makes this whole thing super powerful. Traditionally, when you ask a question like that about real-time information, be it the weather or the news or the stock market or what have you, chat is going to come back to you and say, hey, I don't actually know because I'm trained on historical data. Now it's going to look for the functions that we provided to it and say, can I get an accurate answer to that question by providing parameters to one of these functions? And if it can, it'll give us those parameters and then it'll let us get that real-time information, send it back to the API where it can then formulate its final response, which will have some accurate information about the world around us presently. And so in this case, we simply said, what's the weather like in Boston today? And the result was the current weather in Boston, Massachusetts is 72 degrees Fahrenheit with sunny and windy conditions. So these values, 72 degrees, sunny, windy, these are things that we've actually hard coded into our function. But in the real world, you could actually send a request out to like a weather API and get actual information to send back to the chat completion API. Now that we've run a request here and seen its response, let's go ahead and work through the code. Okay, so at the top, the only thing that's new here is the import of JSON. So we need that JSON module because we're going to do a little bit of what's called serialization. And we're essentially just making sure that our Python data structure can be converted to JSON before we send it over to the API. And when the API sends us back some data, we want to make sure that we can convert that from JSON into something that Python can work with, like a dictionary, for instance. let's take a look now at this function that we defined here. Again, like I said a moment ago, this could potentially call a real world API, some third-party API like a weather API, and then you could get back some real world data. For simplicity's sake, we just hard-coded an object here. Weather info location is the location that gets passed into this function. Temperature is just a hard-coded value of 72. The unit is the unit that gets passed in. If unit argument is omitted whenever the get current weather function is invoked by the program, then it just defaults to Fahrenheit. And then the forecast is a array or a list of some string values, in this case, sunny and windy. So we take that weather info dictionary and we use the JSON module that we imported up top to do something called .dumps, where we pass in the dictionary. And what this will do is it'll return a JSON string, I believe, and we can use that with the chat completions API. So we're going to put all of the rest of the logic of this program inside of a run method, or a run function, I should say. And that just makes it to where at the very bottom of the program, we can control what environment this gets run in. So if this main.py module were to get imported somewhere else, it would not run this code. But if you just run like Python main.py or Python 3 main.py from your terminal or your command line, then it'll know, okay, this needs to be run. You'll see that at the bottom, the code that we have included that does that, but just letting you know that we're going to wrap everything inside of this run function. All right, first things first, we need to create a list of all our functions. In this case, we only have one function. We're still going to use a list, but we're only going to have one object inside of here. And the object's job is to describe that function. So we give it a name here. The keys are all strings. The values are all strings. This is essentially JSON. If you're interested in learning more about JSON schema, there's a link here that you can visit and you can see how this is all structured, why it's structured the way that it is. But we're just trying to put it in a ubiquitous format that can be used with the API. So functions is going to have objects inside of it. The objects are going to have a name property. The name is going to be the name of the function. In this case, we have the get current weather function. So we call it get underscore current underscore weather. The description is just going to describe what the function does. In this case, our function gets the current weather in a given location. So then we move on to the parameters of the function. So if you remember from above, our function took two parameters. It's going to have the location, and then it's going to have the optional unit. And then the unit will default to Fahrenheit, the string value, if it's omitted. We have a type of object just describing the properties object. And then inside the properties object, we actually have the parameters. So the first one is location, and it points to its own special object that takes some additional key value pairs. You have to say the type of the parameter. In this case, the type is string. We also want to describe this particular parameter. So we put a description key and we say something like the city and state, for example, San Francisco, California. This is just meta information for the API so that it knows whenever it decides to use one of our functions, how it should send back the parameters, how it should structure them, what they should look like whenever it sends that data back to us. So then here we have unit. The type is string again, but instead of description, we have something here called enum. Enum just means that this is an enumerable, and essentially that means that anything inside of this list here are the only options that are available to us. So we have either Fahrenheit or Celsius, that is it. So whenever the API sees this, it knows that it has to send back either Fahrenheit or Celsius, nothing else. Now outside of properties, we have required, and this is just a list telling us which of these properties are actually required for this function to run. And in this case, location is the only required parameter. So now that we've defined our functions list, we can use that in our request to the API. So let's go down and look at that. We have a messages variable pointing to a list of message objects. And traditionally, we have a system role as our very first object here, but in this case, we can omit that because by default, the system role is just a helpful assistant. And what we're doing here is we're just sending the initial user role message with its question to the chat completion API. So the content for this one is what's the weather like in Boston? Again, this is hard coded. If you wanted to get user input, refer to video 2 of this series to see how you can easily do that. So we're going to send a couple different requests. Remember in the program flow diagram, I show some back and forth. This is going to require a couple different requests here. And so instead of saying response is equal to the API call, we're going to say this is the first response. So first underscore response is equal to the OpenAI chat completion.create method. and this will send our request to that API. The other thing you'll notice that's different here is the model isn't using GPT 3.5 Turbo, it's using GPT 3.5 Turbo 0613. This is the current version of the model that's trained on the function dataset. Likewise, there's also a 0613 for GPT-4 if you decide to use the more powerful LLM. All right, so messages is going to point to our messages list. That's right here on line 48. Functions is going to point to the functions list. That's what we defined up above. And then here, function call is equal to auto. That is the default whenever you include a functions parameter here, or functions argument in your call to the API. And what auto means is it's just saying that the API can decide whether or not, based on the context of everything, it wants to call one of our functions. You can actually provide an object here with the name of the function if you want to make it call the function every single time. But the API is really powerful, and if it sees a question like what's the weather like, and it sees that we have functions that can handle that, then it's going to know that it needs to provide us with those parameters. So the arguments that you can pass to function call, or the values anyway, are string of auto, string of none, or an object with a name key pointing to the name of the function from your functions that you want it to call. Okay, so since we've called that now, we're going to print the first response. And if you remember from before when we did the example over here, you can see the entire response object. If you look here, there's two different objects. Here's the first one. And this is important because the content of this one inside of choices, the first choice inside of message, the content is normally where we pull that generated text from, but as you can see, it's null. So it's good that we pulled this up, because you should know that if the model decides that it wants to call one of your functions, it's actually not going to provide you with content. It's going to provide you with something called function call. So function call is new to us. It's inside of the message object. You can see this is an assistant role message. And if there's a function call property, then it's going to have a name. The name is going to be the function that it wants you to call from your functions list. And then it's going to have arguments. The arguments are important because that is the arguments that you're going to pass to your function whenever you call it. And the finished reason here is function call. And that's different from what we're normally used to, which is either stop or if we reach our max tokens limit. So function call is telling us like, hey, this is the model wanting us to call one of our functions. So we're going to look more closely at that. But you can see where we print out the second response here. This one actually has the content, and that's what we traverse down into and print at the very bottom. So we're going to get to that in a second, but let's look at our code real quick. We are printing the first response object. We are printing an empty line, and then we're saying first response message is equal to, and we're traversing down into the first response object, looking at the choices list, looking at the first item in that list, and then extracting the message object from it. This is important because this is going to have information that we need to send back to the API. Again, referring back to our program flow, we send the initial request, it sends it back to us. We're about to send another request, and included in that second request is going to be the response from the initial request and the response from calling our function. So down here we do a check. We're saying, hey, inside of the first response message, is there a property called function call? We do that with this .get method. So first response message is a dictionary. So we can use a .get method to check and see if this key exists on that dictionary. If it does, then this if statement will be true, and we will go down into this block. Now we're going to create another dictionary that is available functions. These are the functions that are available to us. The key is the name of the function variable, and then the value is the actual function variable. So now we want to extract the name of the function that the model wants us to call. That's inside of that first response message. It's inside of that function call object, and it has a key called name. That is going to be, in this case, get underscore current underscore weather. So now that we have the function name, we know which of our functions we need to call. This is simple because we only have one function, but if you had more than one, then you would have those listed here. So function args is going to get pulled from the first response message, again into function call, but this time into arguments as opposed to the name key. And so you can see here, these arguments look something like this, like location, Boston, Massachusetts. This is an object, and we can pass the location, the value for the location, into our function call. Because remember, our function requires, at the very minimum, a location argument. So we use JSON loads here, essentially just wrapping this argument's value in JSON loads. Will make it into it'll serialize it into a data type that we can work with in our Python code. Function to call is going to be the available functions object here with the function name as a key. In this case, it'll be get current weather, which will turn the function to call variable into the get current weather variable, or essentially it'll point to that function. Whenever we invoke function to call, we're actually invoking our get current weather. And remember, get current weather was defined at the very beginning right here. So now that we have access to that, we can actually pass in the argument or arguments, depending on whatever parameters were given back to us from the API call, and we can actually get a result here returned to us, and we can do something with it. So let's scroll back down here. A lot of extracting happening here, essentially from the response, just trying to figure out, okay, does it want us to call the function? If so, which function is it? We get the name to determine which function. Okay, now that we know which function, let's get those arguments. Let's make sure that they're in a data type that we can use. So let's do a JSON loads on those. And now let's find the actual function, the function to call from our available functions using the function name. And the last thing we want to do here is invoke the function to call with the arguments. So location is equal to function args.getLocation. Same pattern as the if statement here. We're using the .get method on a dictionary to see if the location attribute is available to us. If it is, it'll get returned here. And then we have units, it is equal to the function args.getUnit. If there is no unit, then I think it's just going to be like an empty string or a none value. Either way, if it's omitted, then it's going to default to Fahrenheit. So the result of calling our function will get stored in this function return value variable. And now we can use that whenever we're sending our second request back over to the chat completions API. Okay, so we need to append the first response message from the API to our messages list. And then right after that, we need to append a new message with a role that we've never seen before. This role is called function as opposed to like system, assistant, or user. And then the name of it needs to be the function name. So that's what we extracted from the previous message. And then the content is going to be the return value of calling that function with those parameters. So we stored that in that function return value variable, and we bundle all that up into an object, append it to our messages list, and now our messages are ready to be sent back to the API to get that final response. So that's what's going to happen right here. We're going to get second underscore response from calling the API a second time, telling it the model is GPT 3.5 Turbo 0613, the version of the model that's trained on function call data. And then we're going to pass in our messages list so that the model has the full context of everything that's happened thus far and can give us the appropriate answer. Now you'll notice that we don't include things like temperature or max tokens here. If you don't include temperature, it'll default to 1. If you don't include max tokens, it'll default to infinity. So make sure that you include those if you want to tweak those to something more specific. But for the sake of just showing you the example here, we can omit them safely. So then down here, we're going to print the result of second response. That's that second object that we saw over here. So this one. And then we're actually going to print an empty line, and then we're going to traverse down into the second response choices list, first item, message object, content attribute, and that's going to give us the string value of the current weather in Boston, Massachusetts is 72 degrees Fahrenheit with sunny and windy conditions. So that's all the back and forth. We're calling the API 2 times. The initial time, it sends a response, we do some checking, we do some extracting, we do a function call, we assign the result of the function call to a variable, we bundle all that together, we send the initial response with our function call response to the API a second time as part of that whole messages list, and it finally comes back to us with the textual response based on the context of everything that we've passed it thus far. And that's what we use to output to the terminal so that the user can see the answer to their initial question in the very first request. Now, I told you at the very bottom, this is where we actually run. You may have seen this pattern before, but essentially in every Python program or every Python module, there's going to be a double underscore variable, and it's going to have the name of the module. In this case, if you run this module with like Python and then the module name, Python main.py in your terminal, then this value will evaluate to double underscore main as a string, in which case we do want to invoke the run function, which will run all of our code. So let's zoom out real quick. I know it's a little small, sorry for those of you on mobile, but let's just take a look at this program because it is a bit longer than the programs we've been writing previously. So we've got our boilerplate stuff up top. We include JSON so we can use the .dumps and .loads methods. We define our function. In this case, we're just including some dummy data to output, but here you could use a third-party API to get some real-world, real-time data. And then we have our run function, which is where we define the rest of all of our code, where we're going to actually interact with the chat completion API. So we define our functions in this JSON schema format, where we have all of the information about our functions. In this case, we only have one function, but we want to describe its parameters, and that will dictate how the model will send back information for us to use to be able to call our function. We're going to create our messages list. We're going to start with the very first message being from our user role, not from the system role like we've been doing previously. We're going to hard code the content. Again, you can get dynamic input if you like. We're going to package that up and send it to the API, but making sure to include the functions in addition to the messages. That way the API knows it has the ability to send back parameters for our function if it wants to. We're going to print our response here, and then we're going to traverse down into that and get the entire first message. We're going to check and see if it wanted us to do a function call. If it did, we're going to extract all the necessary information from that object so that we can do our function call. We're going to store the result of calling our function with those parameters from the initial response from the API in a function return value variable. And then we're going to use that down here to package it up into a message object with a role of function. Before we do that, of course, we need to append the initial response from the API to our messages list. Then we append our new function role message with the name of the function that was called and the content of the result of calling that function. We package that up in our messages list. We send it in our second request to the chat completion API, and the result is going to include the textual response from the API to our initial question from our first response. That's it for doing function calls with OpenAI's chat completion API. Let us know if you have any questions down in the comments below, and we'll catch you all in the next video. Thanks.